The cold January morning air swept across the grounds of Sandringham Estate as King Charles III walked slowly through the frost-covered gardens. His breath formed small clouds in the crisp winter air, and his footsteps crunched softly on the frozen grass beneath his feet. The Christmas decorations had been carefully removed just days before, but the king continued a tradition that few people knew about: his daily morning walks through the estate grounds during the weeks following the holiday season. This particular custom had deep roots in Charles's childhood, when his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, would take him on similar walks through the gardens of Royal Lodge. She taught him that the period after Christmas was not simply a time to rest, but a moment for reflection and preparation for the year ahead. The Queen Mother believed that the silence of winter gardens held wisdom that could only be understood through quiet observation. Charles remembered those early morning walks with vivid clarity. His grandmother would point out the bare branches of ancient oak trees, explaining how they stored energy during the cold months to burst forth with new life in spring. She would show him the hardy winter birds that remained when others had flown south, teaching him about resilience and adaptation. These lessons shaped his understanding of leadership and responsibility long before he knew he would one day wear the crown. Now, as king, Charles maintained this tradition with the same dedication his grandmother had shown. Palace staff had learned to expect his early morning departures, regardless of weather conditions. Rain or shine, snow or frost, the king would emerge from the house at precisely 7 o'clock each morning, dressed in his weathered walking boots and well-worn country jacket. The significance of these walks extended far beyond personal reflection. Charles used this time to think about the challenges facing the monarchy and the nation. During his first January as king, he spent these morning hours considering how to modernize royal traditions while preserving their essential meaning. He thought about environmental issues, social problems, and the changing relationship between the royal family and the British people. Staff members at Sandringham noticed that the king often carried a small notebook during these walks. When he paused to observe something interesting, perhaps the way morning light filtered through bare tree branches, or the behavior of wildlife in the estate grounds, he would make brief notes. These observations later influenced his speeches and public statements throughout the year. The walking route itself held special significance. Charles deliberately chose paths that took him past landmarks connected to previous monarchs. He would pause at the spot where his grandfather, King George VI, used to feed the estate's famous red deer. He would walk past the kitchen garden that his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, had personally tended during her visits to Sandringham. Each location triggered memories and reflections about the weight of royal responsibility. Charles understood that he was not just walking through beautiful countryside, but following in the footsteps of generations of monarchs who had faced their own challenges and uncertainties. The continuity of these simple daily rituals connected him to a legacy that stretched back centuries. Local residents in the villages surrounding Sandringham had grown accustomed to occasionally glimpsing the king during his morning walks. Unlike the formal public appearances that dominated his official schedule, these encounters were refreshingly normal. Charles would nod politely to dog walkers, exchange brief pleasantries with early morning joggers, and sometimes stop to chat with estate workers beginning their daily tasks. These informal interactions revealed an important aspect of Charles's approach to kingship. He believed that understanding his subjects required regular contact with ordinary people living ordinary lives. The post-holiday walking tradition provided opportunities for these connections without the formality and security concerns of official royal visits. The estate gamekeeper, William Thompson, had worked at Sandringham for over 30 years. He remembered Charles as a young prince, and now observed him as king with deep respect. Thompson noticed that Charles paid particular attention to the wildlife during his walks, often asking detailed questions about animal behavior and habitat management. One morning in early January, Thompson encountered the king near a small pond where waterfowl gathered despite the cold weather. Charles stood quietly for several minutes, watching the birds with obvious fascination. When Thompson approached, the king explained that he was observing how different species adapted to winter conditions, some diving for food beneath the ice, others foraging along the frozen shoreline. This conversation revealed Charles's deep environmental consciousness, developed over decades of advocacy for conservation causes. His post-holiday walks were not merely personal therapy, but opportunities to deepen his understanding of the natural world he had pledged to protect. Every observation of animal behavior or seasonal change reinforced his commitment to environmental stewardship. The timing of these walks also held symbolic meaning. The period immediately following Christmas represented a transition from celebration to contemplation, from public festivity to private preparation. Charles used this transition period to mentally prepare for the busy royal calendar that would soon resume. Official engagements, state visits, and ceremonial duties would fill his schedule, but these quiet morning hours provided essential grounding. Palace historians noted that Charles's walking tradition differed significantly from the post-holiday customs of previous monarchs. Queen Victoria preferred to retreat to private rooms for reading and correspondence after Christmas. King Edward VII favored elaborate shooting parties that continued well into January. Queen Elizabeth II spent these weeks reviewing official papers and planning the year's ceremonial calendar. Charles's choice to spend this time outdoors, in direct contact with the natural environment, reflected his personal values and priorities. Environmental protection had been a central theme throughout his life as Prince of Wales, and he was determined that it would remain important during his reign as king. The physical act of walking also provided health benefits that Charles valued highly. At his age, maintaining physical fitness required consistent effort and discipline. The daily walks kept him strong and energetic for the demanding schedule that royal duties required. Palace physicians had long encouraged this regular exercise routine. But the walks served emotional and spiritual purposes beyond physical fitness. Charles found that the rhythm of walking, combined with the beauty of the estate landscape, provided a form of moving meditation. Complex problems seemed more manageable when considered during these peaceful morning hours. Difficult decisions became clearer when surrounded by the timeless beauty of the English countryside. The estate gardens in winter revealed beauty that summer visitors never witnessed. Bare tree branches created intricate patterns against the gray sky. Frost transformed ordinary plants into crystalline sculptures. The absence of colorful flowers allowed subtle textures and shapes to emerge. Charles appreciated this hidden beauty, seeing parallels with the less obvious but equally important aspects of royal duty. Local wildlife had adapted to the king's presence during these regular walks. Rabbits would pause but not flee when he approached. Birds continued their foraging activities nearby. Deer would observe him from a respectful distance, neither frightened nor overly curious. This acceptance by wild animals pleased Charles, who interpreted it as a sign that his movements through their habitat were respectful and non-threatening. The tradition also included specific stopping points that held personal significance. Near the estate's main gate, Charles would pause at a bench dedicated to his grandmother's memory. He would sit quietly for a few minutes, remembering her wisdom and guidance. This daily tribute kept her influence alive in his decision-making process. Another regular stop was at a small memorial grove planted to honor estate workers who had died during their years of service to the royal family. Charles believed that remembering these loyal servants was essential to understanding the true foundation of royal privilege. Their hard work and dedication made the comfortable royal lifestyle possible. The king's walking routes varied slightly from day to day, but always included these meaningful locations. Palace staff understood that these stops were not mere sentiment, but important elements of Charles's approach to leadership. By regularly acknowledging the contributions of previous generations, he maintained perspective on his own role and responsibilities. Weather conditions never deterred these morning expeditions. On rainy days, Charles would don waterproof clothing and continue his routine. Snow and ice required more careful footing, but did not cancel the walks. Estate staff learned to clear essential pathways during severe weather, but Charles adapted his routes rather than abandoning the tradition entirely. The consistency of this practice impressed palace staff and security personnel. They recognized that Charles treated these walks not as optional recreation, but as essential preparation for his royal duties. The discipline required to maintain daily walks regardless of weather or personal mood demonstrated the same commitment he brought to official responsibilities. Local weather patterns meant that January mornings at Sandringham could be quite challenging. Temperatures often dropped below freezing, and wind from the North Sea could be bitter. Yet Charles seemed to draw energy from these harsh conditions, finding them invigorating rather than unpleasant. The king's attire for these walks was deliberately simple and practical. He avoided expensive outdoor clothing in favor of well-made but modest garments that would serve any country walker well. This choice reflected his desire to remain connected to ordinary experiences rather than isolated by royal privilege. Estate groundskeepers noticed that Charles often paused to examine their work during his walks. He would inspect tree pruning, evaluate pathway maintenance, and observe wildlife habitat improvements with genuine interest and expertise. His questions were informed and specific, revealing deep knowledge of countryside management. These interactions with estate staff provided valuable insights into practical conservation work. Charles learned about challenges facing rural workers, changes in wildlife populations, and the effects of weather patterns on landscape management. This knowledge informed his understanding of environmental issues affecting the broader nation. The tradition also served as a bridge between Charles's previous life as Prince of Wales and his current role as king. During his decades as heir to the throne, he had developed strong opinions about environmental protection, organic farming, and sustainable development. The morning walks provided continuity with these long-held interests while adapting them to his new responsibilities. Photography of these private walks was strictly limited, but occasional distant images revealed the king's genuine pleasure in this daily routine. His relaxed posture and natural movements contrasted sharply with the formal bearing required during official engagements. These glimpses of informal royal life humanized the monarch in ways that formal portraits could never achieve. The significance of maintaining royal traditions while adapting them to contemporary circumstances became a defining theme of Charles's reign. The morning walks exemplified this approach, honoring historical precedent while expressing personal values and addressing current challenges. As winter progressed toward spring, Charles would notice subtle changes in the estate landscape during his walks. Earlier sunrise gradually extended his available walking time. Hardy plants began showing signs of new growth. Migratory birds returned to familiar nesting sites. These seasonal rhythms provided natural markers for planning the year ahead. The king's deep appreciation for these natural cycles influenced his approach to the royal calendar. Rather than viewing official duties as disconnected from natural rhythms, he sought ways to align royal activities with seasonal patterns. This philosophy reflected his belief that human institutions should work in harmony with natural systems rather than opposition to them. The afternoon light streamed through the tall windows of Sandringham's library as King Charles III settled into his favorite reading chair. This daily ritual, begun immediately after lunch each day during the post-holiday period, represented another deeply meaningful tradition that few outside the royal household understood. The king's commitment to spending 2 hours each afternoon reading historical documents, biographies of previous monarchs, and contemporary analyses of constitutional monarchy had roots that stretched back to his university years at Cambridge. Unlike the formal briefings that dominated his official schedule, these afternoon reading sessions were entirely self-directed. Charles chose his own materials, set his own pace, and pursued topics that genuinely interested him rather than subjects dictated by immediate political necessities. This intellectual freedom provided essential balance to the constrained nature of most royal activities. The library at Sandringham housed an extraordinary collection of royal historical documents, many of which had never been published or made available to researchers outside the family. Charles had access to personal letters between monarchs, private diaries of royal consorts, and detailed accounts of how previous kings and queens had navigated constitutional crises and social upheavals. During his first January as king, Charles focused particularly on documents relating to the reigns of his predecessors who had faced significant challenges. He studied King George VI's private papers from the abdication crisis, examining how his father had prepared for unexpected kingship. He read Queen Victoria's detailed journals describing her approach to constitutional questions and her relationships with prime ministers. These historical studies were not academic exercises, but practical preparation for the challenges of modern kingship. Charles understood that while circumstances had changed dramatically since previous reigns, fundamental questions about the monarchy's role in democratic society remained relevant. By understanding how earlier monarchs had addressed similar challenges, he could develop his own approach to contemporary issues. The reading routine followed a specific pattern that Charles had refined over many years. He would begin each session by reviewing documents related to current constitutional questions facing the monarchy. Then, he would turn to historical materials that provided context for these issues. Finally, he would read contemporary analyses of monarchy written by respected scholars and political commentators. Palace librarians had learned to anticipate the king's research interests and prepared relevant materials in advance. They would place selected documents on a small table beside his chair, along with notebooks for recording important observations and questions for further investigation. Charles appreciated this thoughtful preparation, which allowed him to maximize the value of his limited reading time. The note-taking process revealed Charles's systematic approach to learning from historical precedent. He would record specific examples of how previous monarchs had handled delicate political situations, noting both successful strategies and apparent mistakes. These observations later influenced his own decisions about when to intervene in political matters and when to maintain constitutional neutrality. One afternoon in early January, Charles spent considerable time reading correspondence between King George V and his private secretary during the constitutional crisis of 1931. The documents revealed the careful balance the king had maintained between supporting the government and protecting constitutional principles during a period of severe economic hardship and political instability. These historical parallels seemed particularly relevant as Charles considered his own role during contemporary economic challenges. The letters showed how King George V had used private conversations with political leaders to encourage cooperation and compromise without publicly taking sides in partisan debates. This approach provided a model for Charles's own interactions with government officials. The afternoon reading sessions also included time for studying the constitutional frameworks of other modern monarchies. Charles was particularly interested in how constitutional monarchs in Scandinavia, the Netherlands, and Belgium had adapted their roles to changing social expectations while maintaining political neutrality and public support. Royal staff noticed that Charles often requested specific documents based on current events and political developments. When constitutional questions arose in Parliament or the media, he would ask librarians to locate historical precedents and scholarly analyses related to those specific issues. This responsive approach to research ensured that his historical knowledge remained relevant to contemporary challenges. The privacy of these reading sessions was carefully protected. Unlike many royal activities, which involved multiple staff members and security personnel, Charles insisted that his afternoon reading time be minimally supervised. A single security officer remained discreetly nearby, and library staff were available if needed, but otherwise the king was left alone with his books and thoughts. This insistence on privacy reflected Charles's understanding that effective leadership required uninterrupted time for reflection and learning. The constant presence of advisors and staff members, while necessary for most royal duties, could prevent the deep thinking that complex problems required. The afternoon reading sessions provided essential intellectual space for processing information and developing personal perspectives. Palace observers noted that Charles's mood often improved noticeably after these reading sessions. Staff members could tell when he had discovered particularly interesting historical insights or found useful precedents for current challenges. His evening conversations with family members and senior staff reflected the intellectual stimulation he gained from these daily studies. The selection of reading materials revealed Charles's sophisticated understanding of constitutional monarchy and his commitment to fulfilling that role effectively. Rather than avoiding complex or controversial topics, he actively sought out materials that challenged his thinking and expanded his knowledge of difficult constitutional questions. Biography reading formed another important component of these afternoon sessions. Charles had worked his way through detailed lives of most British monarchs since the Restoration, paying particular attention to how each had interpreted their constitutional role and managed relationships with Parliament, the Church, and the public. Queen Elizabeth I's approach to religious conflicts particularly interested Charles, given contemporary debates about the monarchy's relationship with diverse religious communities. He studied how she had maintained the principle of religious supremacy while accommodating practical religious diversity within her realm. These historical examples informed his own thinking about the Church of England's role in modern British society. The reading sessions also included contemporary political science and constitutional law texts. Charles believed that understanding current academic thinking about monarchy was essential for adapting the institution to changing circumstances. He regularly read articles from constitutional law journals and political science publications, keeping current with scholarly debates about democratic monarchy. International perspectives on constitutional monarchy featured prominently in Charles's reading list. He studied how monarchies in other countries had evolved their roles and maintained public support in democratic societies. These comparative studies provided valuable insights into alternative approaches to royal duties and constitutional relationships. One particularly influential book that Charles read during his first post-holiday period as king was a comprehensive analysis of how Scandinavian monarchies had successfully modernized their operations while maintaining essential ceremonial and constitutional functions. The author's detailed examination of specific reforms and their outcomes provided practical ideas for potential changes to British royal practices. Legal scholars' analyses of constitutional conventions particularly fascinated Charles. These unwritten rules and traditions that governed royal behavior were complex and sometimes contradictory. Understanding their historical development and current interpretation was essential for avoiding constitutional mistakes that could damage the monarchy's reputation or effectiveness. The king's reading notes revealed his particular interest in precedents for royal involvement in environmental and social issues. He carefully studied examples of previous monarchs who had used their positions to promote causes they believed would benefit the nation, while maintaining appropriate constitutional boundaries. Queen Victoria's advocacy for various social causes provided useful examples, though Charles recognized that 19th-century precedents required careful adaptation to contemporary democratic expectations. He was particularly interested in how Victoria had balanced personal convictions with constitutional neutrality in her relationships with governments of different political perspectives. Historical accounts of royal households' internal operations also featured in Charles's reading program. He studied how previous monarchs had organized their staff, managed their finances, and coordinated their various residences. This practical information helped him make informed decisions about modernizing royal administrative practices. The tradition of afternoon reading had been strongly encouraged by Charles's father, Prince Philip, who believed that intellectual curiosity and continuous learning were essential qualities for effective monarchy. Philip had maintained his own reading program throughout his adult life, focusing particularly on scientific and technological developments that affected British society and the Commonwealth. Charles's approach to reading differed from his father's scientific focus, emphasizing instead historical and constitutional studies that directly related to royal duties. However, both men shared the conviction that royal responsibilities required serious intellectual preparation and ongoing education about changing circumstances. Palace librarians appreciated the king's respectful treatment of historical documents and rare books. Unlike casual readers who might handle materials carelessly, Charles approached each document with appropriate reverence for its historical significance. His careful note-taking and thoughtful questions demonstrated genuine scholarly interest in the materials. The library setting itself contributed to the effectiveness of these reading sessions. Sandringham's library had been carefully designed to provide optimal conditions for serious study, with comfortable seating, excellent lighting, and minimal distractions. The room's quiet atmosphere and beautiful furnishings created an environment conducive to deep thinking and learning. Charles often combined his reading with light refreshments brought by palace staff. A simple tea service with biscuits provided sustenance without disrupting concentration. The king preferred Earl Grey tea, served without elaborate ceremony that might detract from the intellectual focus of the session. Weather conditions outside sometimes influenced Charles's choice of reading materials. On particularly gray winter days, he might choose uplifting biographical accounts of royal achievements and successes. During periods of bright sunshine, he felt drawn to more challenging constitutional analyses that required sustained concentration. The cumulative effect of these daily reading sessions was substantial. Over the course of each post-holiday period, Charles absorbed enormous amounts of historical information and contemporary analysis relevant to his royal duties. This systematic approach to learning ensured that his decision-making was informed by both historical precedent and current scholarship. Staff members noticed that Charles would sometimes reference insights from his afternoon reading during evening discussions about current royal business. These connections between historical examples and contemporary challenges demonstrated his ability to apply scholarly learning to practical problems facing the monarchy. The king's commitment to maintaining this reading tradition regardless of other pressures impressed palace staff and constitutional experts. Even when urgent matters demanded attention, Charles insisted on preserving time for study and reflection. This discipline reflected his understanding that effective kingship required both immediate responsiveness and long-term perspective. Constitutional scholars who had opportunities to discuss these reading sessions with Charles were struck by the depth and sophistication of his historical knowledge. His questions revealed genuine understanding of complex constitutional principles and their practical applications. This scholarly approach to royal duties distinguished him from monarchs who might rely primarily on advisors' briefings and recommendations. The afternoon reading tradition also provided valuable continuity with Charles's previous intellectual interests as Prince of Wales. Throughout his adult life, he had been known for serious engagement with complex issues and scholarly approaches to problem-solving. Maintaining this intellectual curiosity as king ensured that his reign would be informed by thoughtful analysis rather than mere tradition or instinct. The warm glow of candles flickered across the polished dining room table at Sandringham as King Charles III prepared for what had become one of his most cherished post-holiday traditions, the weekly dinner gatherings with estate staff and local community members. These informal meals, held every Thursday evening during January and February, represented a radical departure from conventional royal dining practices and reflected Charles's deep commitment to breaking down barriers between the monarchy and ordinary citizens. The idea for these community dinners had originated during Charles's years as Prince of Wales, when he had observed how isolated the royal family could become from the daily experiences of the people they served. Unlike the formal state banquets and ceremonial dinners that dominated the official royal calendar, these Thursday evening gatherings were deliberately casual, warm, and focused on genuine conversation rather than protocol and ceremony. Palace staff had initially expressed concerns about security and protocol when Charles first proposed these dinners. The idea of inviting estate workers, local farmers, village shopkeepers, and their families to dine regularly with the king seemed unprecedented and potentially problematic. However, Charles had insisted that understanding his subjects required regular contact with people from all walks of life, not just politicians, diplomats, and other members of the elite. The guest list for each Thursday dinner was carefully but thoughtfully composed. Charles personally approved every invitation, ensuring that the gatherings included a diverse mix of ages, occupations, and backgrounds from the local community. Estate workers who maintained the Sandringham grounds sat alongside village teachers, local business owners, and retired farmers who had worked the surrounding land for decades. Mrs. Margaret Thompson, the estate's head housekeeper, initially worried about the practical challenges of serving dinner to such mixed groups. Royal dining had traditionally followed strict rules of precedence, seating arrangements, and service procedures that seemed incompatible with the relaxed atmosphere Charles wanted to create. However, the king had been clear that these dinners should feel like gatherings of friends and neighbors rather than formal royal occasions. The solution had been to adapt rather than abandon royal dining traditions. The finest china and crystal were still used, but guests were encouraged to serve themselves from platters passed around the table rather than being formally served by livered footmen. Place cards indicated where each person should sit, but conversation was allowed to flow naturally without the rigid structure typical of state dinners. Charles himself took an active role in planning these dinners, personally reviewing menus and suggesting dishes that would appeal to his guests' tastes. Rather than the elaborate French cuisine traditionally associated with royal dining, the meals featured hearty British fare prepared with ingredients sourced from local farms and the estate's own gardens. The king's genuine interest in his guests' lives and work became the defining characteristic of these dinners. Rather than making polite small talk, Charles engaged in detailed conversations about farming challenges, village politics, local history, and family traditions. His questions were specific and informed, revealing that he had taken time to learn about each guest's background and interests before the meal. Tom Williams, a local dairy farmer who attended one of the first dinners, later described his amazement at Charles's detailed knowledge of milk pricing, feed costs, and the challenges facing small family farms. The king had clearly studied current agricultural issues and understood the economic pressures affecting rural communities. This preparation impressed guests and demonstrated respect for their expertise and experiences. The conversations during these dinners provided Charles with invaluable insights into the real-world effects of government policies and economic changes on ordinary citizens. Unlike the filtered information he received through official briefings and formal meetings with local representatives, these casual dinner conversations revealed unvarnished truth about how national issues affected individual families and communities. Estate groundskeeper James Mitchell had worked at Sandringham for over 20 years and initially felt nervous about dining with the king. However, Charles's relaxed manner and genuine curiosity about estate management quickly put him at ease. Their conversation about sustainable landscaping practices and wildlife conservation proved so engaging that it continued long after the meal had ended. These extended conversations revealed Charles's remarkable ability to connect with people from all backgrounds while drawing on his extensive knowledge of environmental and agricultural issues. Guests consistently noted that the king listened more than he spoke, asking thoughtful questions that encouraged them to share their experiences and perspectives. The timing of these dinners during the post-holiday period was deliberate and significant. January and February traditionally represented quiet months in the royal calendar, allowing Charles to focus on these community connections without the pressure of major official engagements. The winter season also meant that local farmers and estate workers had more time available for evening social activities. Local families appreciated the inclusive nature of the invitations. Unlike many royal events that were limited to dignitaries and officials, these dinners welcomed spouses, adult children, and even occasionally teenage grandchildren of community members. This family-friendly approach created a warm, natural atmosphere that encouraged genuine conversation and relationship building. Sarah Peterson, whose husband managed the estate's woodland areas, brought her teenage daughter Emma to one dinner and was delighted by Charles's patient answers to the girls' questions about environmental conservation and royal responsibilities. The king's ability to communicate complex ideas in accessible language impressed both mother and daughter. The physical setting for these dinners contributed significantly to their success. Rather than using the grand dining room reserved for state occasions, Charles chose a smaller, more intimate space that seated approximately 16 people around a single table. This arrangement ensured that everyone could participate in conversations and no one felt excluded or overlooked. Careful attention to lighting and music created an atmosphere that was elegant but not intimidating. Soft classical music played quietly in the background, and the warm glow from table candles and wall sconces made the room feel welcoming rather than formal. Fresh flowers from the estate's gardens provided colorful centerpieces that sparked conversations about gardening and seasonal changes. The menu planning for these dinners required balancing Charles's desire for high-quality cuisine with his guests' likely preferences and dietary restrictions. Palace chefs worked closely with the king to develop dishes that were sophisticated but not exotic, beautifully presented but not intimidating to guests unfamiliar with formal dining. A typical dinner might begin with a hearty soup made from vegetables grown in the estate's gardens, followed by roasted local lamb or beef accompanied by seasonal vegetables and traditional British sides. Desserts were often classic British puddings or locally sourced fruits prepared in simple but elegant ways. This approach honored culinary traditions while showcasing the quality of local ingredients. Wine selections for these dinners reflected Charles's environmental values and support for local producers. Rather than serving expensive French wines traditionally associated with royal dining, the king often chose excellent English wines from vineyards he had personally visited and supported. This choice provided talking points about the growing success of English wine production and climate change adaptation. The conversations during these dinners frequently touched on environmental themes that were close to Charles's heart. However, rather than lecturing his guests about conservation, the king asked questions about their observations of environmental changes in their daily work and lives. These discussions provided him with grassroots perspectives on climate change effects that formal environmental reports could not capture. Local beekeeper Mary Foster shared detailed observations about changes in bee behavior and flowering patterns that she had noticed over 20 years of managing hives near the estate. Her practical knowledge fascinated Charles, who took notes and later incorporated her insights into speeches about biodiversity conservation. The success of these community dinners had not gone unnoticed by constitutional experts and royal watchers. Some traditionalists expressed concern about the informality and potential security risks of regular contact with ordinary citizens. However, supporters argued that these gatherings represented exactly the kind of modernization the monarchy needed to remain relevant in contemporary democratic society. Palace security had adapted their procedures to accommodate these dinners without compromising safety or destroying the relaxed atmosphere Charles wanted to maintain. Discreet background checks were conducted on all guests, and security personnel remained nearby but out of sight during the meals. The balance between protection and accessibility required constant fine-tuning. Charles's personal staff noted significant improvements in his mood and energy following these Thursday dinners. The king clearly found these interactions energizing and inspiring, often staying up late afterward to make notes about interesting conversations and insights he had gained. This positive effect on royal morale justified the additional effort required to organize these events. The ripple effects of these dinners extended far beyond the immediate participants. Guests often shared their experiences with friends and family members, creating positive word-of-mouth publicity for the monarchy throughout the local community. Stories of Charles's genuine interest in ordinary people's lives and his accessible, down-to-earth manner spread widely. Local newspaper coverage of these dinners was generally positive, with reporters noting the contrast between Charles's approach and more traditional royal practices. Photographs of the king laughing with estate workers and listening intently to local farmers projected an image of a monarch genuinely connected to his people's concerns and experiences. The educational value of these dinners for Charles himself was enormous. Each gathering provided intensive exposure to perspectives and experiences that formal briefings could never convey. The cumulative effect of dozens of these conversations was a deep, practical understanding of how national policies and economic changes affected real families and communities. Restaurant consultant David Hughes, who occasionally advised palace kitchens, observed one of these dinners and was struck by the genuine warmth of the interactions. Unlike many formal royal meals he had witnessed, where conversation could feel stilted and artificial, these Thursday gatherings buzzed with natural, engaged discussion that continued well past the planned ending time. The tradition also provided opportunities for Charles to recognize and thank people whose contributions to community life might otherwise go unacknowledged. During each dinner, he would take a few moments to publicly thank specific guests for their service to the local community, their dedication to their work, or their contributions to local charitable causes. These moments of recognition were deeply meaningful to recipients and their families. Being personally thanked by the king for their everyday work and community service validated the importance of their contributions and strengthened their connection to the monarchy. Such recognition also encouraged continued civic engagement and community service. The logistics of organizing these dinners required careful coordination between royal household staff and local community leaders. Invitations had to be issued well in advance to allow guests time to arrange their schedules, and dietary restrictions and accessibility needs had to be accommodated. Despite these challenges, the events ran smoothly thanks to experienced royal event planners. Transportation was provided for guests who needed assistance reaching Sandringham, ensuring that age or mobility issues did not prevent community members from participating. This thoughtful attention to practical details demonstrated the royal household's commitment to making these events truly inclusive and accessible. As winter progressed toward spring, Charles began planning how to maintain these community connections throughout the year. While the intensive Thursday dinner series was specifically a post-holiday tradition, he was exploring ways to continue regular informal contact with local residents during other seasons. The success of the winter dinners had convinced him that such connections were essential to effective modern monarchy. The soft morning light filtered through the ornate windows of the Sandringham Chapel as King Charles III knelt in quiet prayer, continuing what had become perhaps the most deeply personal of his post-holiday traditions. Every Sunday morning throughout January and February, the king would arrive at the chapel 30 minutes before the regular service began, seeking solitude and spiritual reflection that prepared him for both the worship service and the week ahead. This private prayer time represented far more than simple religious observance. For Charles, these moments of solitude in the sacred space provided essential spiritual grounding for the enormous responsibilities of kingship. The weight of the crown, both literal and metaphorical, required strength that came not just from constitutional knowledge or political wisdom, but from deeper spiritual resources that could only be cultivated through regular prayer and contemplation. The chapel itself held profound significance in Charles's spiritual development. Built in 1878 during Queen Victoria's reign, the building had witnessed decades of royal prayers, both private and public. Charles's great-grandfather, King George V, had worshipped here during some of the most challenging periods of his reign, including the difficult years of the First World War when the monarchy's future seemed uncertain. Walking into this historic space each Sunday morning, Charles felt connected to generations of monarchs who had sought divine guidance for the challenges of royal leadership. The worn stone floors, polished wooden pews, and beautiful stained glass windows seemed to hold the accumulated prayers and hopes of his predecessors, providing comfort and continuity during his own moments of uncertainty and difficulty. The chapel's relative simplicity compared to grander royal religious venues like Westminster Abbey or St. George's Chapel at Windsor made it particularly suitable for private contemplation. Without the elaborate ceremonial elements that dominated state religious occasions, Charles could focus entirely on personal spiritual reflection rather than public performance of royal religious duties. His prayer routine followed a pattern that had evolved over many years of spiritual practice. Charles would begin by reading selected passages from the Book of Common Prayer, focusing particularly on prayers for wisdom, strength, and guidance in leadership responsibilities. These traditional Anglican prayers connected him to centuries of English religious heritage while addressing timeless human needs for divine assistance. Following the formal prayers, Charles would spend time in silent meditation, a practice he had learned from various spiritual traditions during his years as Prince of Wales. This quiet contemplation allowed him to clear his mind of immediate concerns and open himself to deeper spiritual insights that might inform his approach to royal duties and personal relationships. The king's meditation practice drew from multiple sources, including Christian mystical traditions, Buddhist mindfulness techniques, and Islamic contemplative practices he had studied during interfaith dialogues. This inclusive approach to spirituality reflected his deep respect for the religious diversity of modern Britain and his understanding that wisdom could be found in many traditions. During these meditation periods, Charles would often reflect on specific challenges facing the monarchy or the nation, seeking spiritual perspective that might illuminate solutions or approaches that purely political analysis could not provide. Some of his most important decisions as king had emerged from insights gained during these quiet Sunday morning prayer sessions. The chapel's acoustics enhanced the meditative quality of these sessions. The high vaulted ceiling and stone walls created a natural resonance that made even quiet sounds seem profound and meaningful. Charles appreciated how his own breathing and heartbeat seemed amplified in the sacred space, creating a rhythm that facilitated deeper contemplation. Father Michael Robertson, the chapel's rector, had learned to respect the king's need for solitude during these early morning visits. Rather than attempting to provide pastoral guidance or engage in conversation, Father Robertson would simply unlock the chapel and ensure that Charles could pray without interruption. This respectful distance allowed for authentic spiritual experience rather than formal religious ceremony. The timing of these prayer sessions was carefully chosen to provide maximum spiritual benefit. Arriving before the chapel filled with other worshippers allowed Charles to establish a contemplative mood that could be maintained throughout the regular service. This preparation helped him participate more fully in communal worship while retaining the insights gained through private prayer. Charles's approach to these prayer sessions reflected his understanding that effective monarchy required not just political and constitutional knowledge, but spiritual wisdom that could guide decision-making during complex or unprecedented situations. The challenges of modern kingship often involved moral and ethical dimensions that required more than practical expertise to navigate successfully. The king's prayer journal, kept privately throughout his adult life, revealed the evolution of his spiritual thinking during these post-holiday periods. Early entries focused primarily on personal spiritual development and family concerns. More recent entries showed his wrestling with questions about the monarchy's role in an increasingly secular society and his responsibilities as supreme governor of the Church of England. Constitutional experts had noted that Charles's approach to his religious role as monarch differed significantly from his mother's more traditional Anglican practice. While Queen Elizabeth II had maintained formal correctness in all religious matters, Charles brought a more questioning, exploratory approach to spiritual questions that reflected his broader intellectual curiosity and interfaith interests. This difference in spiritual approach created both opportunities and challenges for Charles's reign. His deeper engagement with religious and ethical questions potentially offered richer resources for moral leadership, but also raised questions about how his personal spiritual evolution might affect his constitutional role as head of the established church. During one particularly meaningful prayer session in late January, Charles spent considerable time contemplating the relationship between personal faith and public duty. The challenges of maintaining authentic spiritual life while fulfilling highly visible ceremonial religious obligations required careful balance and ongoing spiritual discipline that these private prayer times helped to maintain. The chapel's memorial plaques and monuments provided focal points for Charles's prayers for previous monarchs and their families. He would often pray specifically for the wisdom to learn from his predecessors' successes while avoiding their mistakes. These historical connections grounded his spiritual practice in the specific traditions and challenges of royal service. Local residents had grown accustomed to seeing the king's security detail discreetly positioned around the chapel grounds during these Sunday morning prayer sessions. The sight of royal protection officers maintaining respectful distance while the king prayed privately had become a familiar and somehow reassuring presence in the village's weekly routine. The integration of private prayer with public worship created meaningful continuity for Charles's spiritual practice. Insights gained during solitary contemplation could be reinforced and expanded through participation in communal worship, while the formal liturgy and hymns provided structure and tradition that grounded his more experimental spiritual explorations. Charles's choice of biblical readings during his private prayer time often reflected current challenges facing the monarchy or the nation. During periods of economic difficulty, he might focus on passages about justice and concern for the poor. When constitutional questions arose, he would turn to texts about the responsibilities of leadership and the dangers of power. The king's approach to intercessory prayer revealed his deep sense of responsibility for his subjects' welfare. Rather than praying primarily for personal needs or desires, Charles focused his petitions on requests for wisdom in serving others effectively, strength to bear the burdens of office gracefully, and guidance in promoting justice and peace throughout the realm. These prayer sessions also provided opportunities for Charles to process the emotional challenges of kingship. The isolation that came with royal position, the constant scrutiny from media and public, and the weight of constitutional responsibilities created stresses that required spiritual as well as practical management strategies. The chapel's beautiful stained glass windows, depicting various biblical scenes and Christian symbols, provided visual focal points that enhanced Charles's contemplative practice. The play of morning sunlight through colored glass created shifting patterns of light and shadow that seemed to mirror the complex spiritual and emotional landscapes he was exploring through prayer. Father Robertson noticed that Charles often remained in prayer longer during periods when the monarchy faced particular challenges or criticisms. These extended sessions seemed to provide the spiritual resources necessary for maintaining equanimity and wisdom during difficult times when public pressure and political complications threatened to overwhelm careful judgment. The king's prayer practice also included regular expressions of gratitude for the privileges and opportunities that came with royal position. Despite the burdens and constraints of kingship, Charles recognized that his role provided unique opportunities to serve others and promote causes he believed would benefit society. The inclusive nature of Charles's spiritual interests sometimes created interesting dynamics with traditional Anglican worship. While he maintained proper respect for established church liturgy during public services, his private prayers drew from much broader spiritual traditions that reflected his commitment to interfaith understanding and respect for religious diversity. Local church members who worshipped alongside the king during regular Sunday services noted his obvious sincerity and engagement during communal worship. His participation in hymn singing, responsive readings, and corporate prayers seemed genuine and heartfelt rather than merely ceremonial or dutiful. The chapel's role as a place of refuge and renewal for Charles became increasingly important as his reign progressed. The regular rhythm of Sunday morning prayer provided stability and continuity during periods of rapid change and challenge that tested both his personal resilience and his understanding of royal responsibility. Security considerations for these prayer sessions required careful balance between protection and spiritual authenticity. Royal protection officers had learned to maintain necessary vigilance while respecting the sacred nature of the king's private devotions. Their discreet presence ensured safety without destroying the contemplative atmosphere essential for meaningful spiritual practice. The broader significance of Charles's commitment to regular spiritual practice extended beyond personal benefits to encompass the monarchy's relationship with British religious life. His visible dedication to prayer and worship, combined with his respect for diverse faith traditions, helped maintain the monarchy's relevance in an increasingly pluralistic society. Constitutional scholars observed that Charles's approach to the spiritual dimensions of kingship might influence how future monarchs understood their religious responsibilities. His integration of traditional Anglican practice with broader spiritual exploration could provide a model for maintaining religious leadership roles while respecting contemporary religious diversity. The king's prayer journals from this period revealed his ongoing struggle to balance personal spiritual growth with constitutional obligations as supreme governor of the Church of England. These private writings showed a thoughtful, questioning approach to religious authority that sought to serve both traditional Anglican constituencies and Britain's increasingly diverse religious communities. As winter progressed toward spring, Charles's Sunday morning prayer sessions began incorporating themes of renewal and hope that reflected both seasonal changes and spiritual growth. These prayers for new beginnings and fresh opportunities provided spiritual preparation for the busy royal calendar that would resume with spring's arrival. The cumulative effect of these weekly prayer sessions was substantial and enduring. The spiritual discipline, constitutional reflection, and emotional processing that occurred during these private devotions provided essential foundation for Charles's public service and personal well-being throughout his reign.